All right, well, thank you everybody for attending the Range Cattle REC webinar today. And my name is Brent Sellers. I'm the Extension Weed Specialist and Center Director of the Research Center. And I'm going to cover some of the work we've been working on the past couple years where we're looking at applying hexazinone with fertilizer for smutgrass control. So I don't think I have to go into a lot of description about what smutgrass is. At least in Florida, I think most people are pretty familiar with it. And in fact, this picture is a pretty common sight across South Florida, especially pastures. A lot of pastures are infested with giant smutgrass. We used to have small smutgrass, and that's still around to some extent, but giant smutgrass has definitely taken over. So there's two weedy Spirobolus. Spirobolus is the genus for smutgrass species in the state. And there are about 30 or so different species within that same genus. Most of those are pretty much not a problem. In fact, we have a few natives in Florida that we'll see in our rangeland that generally just are there. They are not as aggressive as these non-native invasive smutgrass species. But like I said, this is a pretty common sight. And in fact, I would say this is one that could be controlled and you could get the pasture back eventually. It's just going to take some time and some effort. It's pastures that are worse than this when we need to start thinking about renovation. So how do we control it? We only have one herbicide for selective control in Bahia grass pastures, and that is Velpar or hexazinone or tied hexazinone or Velosa. And I put a double asterisk on Velosa because it is slightly different from Velpar and tied hexazinone. And it's different in that it contains more active ingredient per gallon of product. So the rate structure is a little bit different for Velosa. So if you ever use Velosa, we have to be cognizant of that difference. So usually I would say 1.5 quarts per acre of the Velpar or tied hexazinone, to be a little bit less than that for the Velosa, is kind of your minimum rate that you would be using. Most often I recommend 2 quarts per acre. And some people will use 1 quart per acre. That is extremely inconsistent. But if you're looking at a multi-year program, 1 quart per acre may not be a bad idea. It needs to be applied during the summer season because we need rainfall. And I'll show you some data on this in a little bit to get the herbicide into the soil solution for root uptake. There's very little foliar activity on smutgrass itself. And when we talk about other weed species, especially broadleaf weeds, this acts more like a contact herbicide. So it is taken up by the leaves of broadleaf plants. But weedy grasses, it is through root uptake. So we do need that rainfall for optimum activity using hexazinone. When we make that effort to start controlling smutgrass, we usually end up with some shortcomings of some sort. We might have large open spots. So where the smutgrass dies, you have no Bahia grass there. So the next thing that comes in is usually a weed, usually dog fennel or tropical soda. Cost of hexazinone is pretty high. So we're looking somewhere between $30, $35, $45 per acre. And it's extremely inconsistent. Even at the maximum rate, which is just a little over 2 quarts per acre, it can be extremely inconsistent. And I think we finally figured out why that is, and it's all related to rainfall. I shouldn't say all, but mostly related to rainfall. So a few years ago, we started an experiment where we were applying hexazinone on smutgrass every week, beginning in April and ending at the end of August or early September. So these blue bars represent the control of smutgrass at 30 days after treatment, and the orange line represents the amount of rainfall that we received within 1 week after application. Okay, so you're going to see these blue bars jump around quite a bit, as does the rainfall. All right, so we started out in April. We had about 1 inch of rainfall, and we ended up with 65% control. I also need to say that this went out at 2 quarts per acre, so you know that it was the maximum, or our normal recommendation for smutgrass control. Okay, so early April, smutgrass typically isn't growing that well. We wouldn't expect that high level of control, which really isn't what we got. We got about 65%. We go into the last week of April, where we received no rainfall for 7 days, and we only got 20% control. So that immediately shows you there's an effective rainfall right there. If we go further into the growing season, so early June, we had over 5 inches of rainfall within the first 7 days after application and only 50% control. We go into July, and July through September is really my window of recommendation for smutgrass control using hexazinone. And we had no rainfall for 7 days and only 50% control. When we go past July and we got upwards of 2 inches mid and towards the end of July, and then also in August, we were upwards of 80% control, but where rainfall was limited, less than half an inch, we're still getting less than 70% control. But if we're over a quarter or half an inch, we typically are somewhere around 70 to 80, sometimes 90% control. Okay, so that was in 2016. I'm not showing you the data in 2017. I'm going to jump ahead to 2018. And a very different story than what we saw from 2016, but also we had pretty significant rainfall that started in May of 2018. So the smutgrass started growing earlier. Our soils had more water in them throughout the entire growing season. And even though we did have no rainfall for 7 days in mid-July, we still got upwards of 90% control. And I think that had something to do with the amount of water that was in our soils at that point in time. So if our soils were saturated, and not standing water, but the soils were saturated, and you spray the hexazinone, it has nowhere to go. Versus we start off early in the season and we don't have a lot of water in the soil, then the rainfall will take the hexazinone down through the soil profile with it. So I think that's why 2018 was so much different when we compare it back to 2016. Different growing season, different rainfall patterns, different soil conditions. So, but again, this really points out the inconsistencies that we can have from year to year with hexazinone. So I was always looking for ways or different approaches to try to manage smutgrass and try to make hexazinone more consistent. And that's been a real struggle. I think everybody can agree with that. And a couple years ago, a friend of mine here in Ona called me one day and said, "You need to go buy my pasture. I did something that's totally against your recommendations." He goes, "But I had to do something. My pasture's right against the main highway. There's so much smutgrass in it, I just had to do something. And you need to go look at it because it shouldn't have worked." He went out in April. So again, I normally recommend July through late August, early September. He also decided to fertilize with 32% UAN. Got no rainfall for 2 weeks. And when it did rain, they got between 3 and 4 inches of rainfall. So in theory, that practice should not have worked at all. However, probably by the end of that year, he was close to 70% control. The negative side of that is he probably injured his Bahara grass more than he would have during the summer. But seeing a positive response on smutgrass with the hexazinone using a 32% UAN really sparked my interest. So we started a trial last year, and we applied hexazinone at 1 and 2 quarts per acre. So again, 2 quarts is my normal recommended rate, 1 quart's the half rate, which is usually really inconsistent. And we mix that in either water or 32% UAN, putting out about 50 pounds of N per acre. We used a tractor sprayer, and we're calibrated at 20 gallons per acre. So we're putting 20 gallons of spray solution out per acre. And this is the minimum that I would recommend. Usually I'm somewhere around 30 gallons per acre when I'm applying herbicides and pastures. If you do go below 20 gallons per acre, the hexazinone does not tend to work. If you go up to 60 gallons per acre, it's no better than 30 or 20. So we have figured that out over the years as well. To evaluate control, we looked at visual estimates of control, and I have some pictures to show you of that. And then we also had 0 and 60 day after treatment plant counts. We used line transects, and whichever smutgrass plant touched that line, we dug down in it and made sure that it was completely dead. And if there's any green on that plant, we said it was alive. And we converted that to percent of control based on our initial counts that we had. So this slide shows the visual estimates of control. So that's what these numbers are on the y-axis. We have the hexazinone rate in either 1 or 2 quarts per acre. And the blue bars is the hexazinone mixed in water. And the orange bars is the hexazinone mixed in 32% UAN. So we can see at 1 quart, we definitely saw a pretty substantial increase, almost 20-30% increase in smutgrass control, visual estimates. Versus 2 quarts, which is our normal application rate, there is really no bump by adding that 32% UAN. When we actually look at density, it's a little bit of a different story. It's still kind of the same trends, but a little bit different, because when you're looking at plants visually and you're looking at the top growth of those plants and they look dead and crispy, but when you actually dig down in the clumps and see green tissue, and we had to make sure it wasn't Bahia grass growing through the clump, we saw a little bit of difference, and actually a more pronounced effect, I guess, if you could say, at the 1 quart per acre rate, only about doubled our control, maybe a little bit more than that, when we added the 32% UAN. So that was pretty substantial when you're actually looking at densities. The story is kind of the same when you look at 2 quarts per acre, but even then you see a little bit, even though it's not statistically different, you see a little bit of a difference between hexazinone that was mixed in water versus hexazinone that was mixed in 32% UAN. Now we're just looking at the effects of hexazinone. So we're actually averaging over both nitrogen rates, 0 nitrogen or 50 pounds of N per acre. So 1 quart per acre is in the blue bars, 2 quarts per acre is in the orange bars, and visual control is pretty much exactly what we'd expect to see. Lower control with the half rate of hexazinone, but still 75% with the half rate is pretty good. But again, you have to remember that this is visual estimates of control. When you look at plant density, it's a little bit of a different story. So you're looking at about half the level of control when you actually dig down in those plants and see if it's actually living or not. But still, 50% isn't that bad when you're reducing your cost by half. So I can talk about that later if that comes up in questions. And this slide is just looking at the nitrogen effect. So this is averaged over both rates of hexazinone. So visual control without any nitrogen, we're below 80%. With nitrogen, we're a little above 90%. So we do see a significant increase in smutgrass control by adding the nitrogen to it. With plant density, same story, but we're seeing a little bit better response, better difference between no nitrogen versus 50 pounds of nitrogen with the 32% UAN, but still we're below 80%. And I'd kind of expect that, just the inconsistency in the product and the variability in rainfall that we have. Now, one thing that I didn't touch on with this experiment is that one site was slightly elevated compared to the other, and I couldn't separate them out statistically because the pattern was the same. But when you look at the overall control from the slightly higher elevated site compared to the lower site where the soil is a little bit more saturated, we saw nearly 80% control across the board, at least 80% control. So there's obviously a difference in the amount of water that's in that soil and how the hexazinone is acting. So I wanted to show a few pictures. So this is 1 quart per acre in water. Again, visually, that doesn't look that bad. A lot of the green material that you're seeing in that plot is actually Bahia grass. The smutgrass in that plot wasn't that dense. But as we moved across the study, the smutgrass became more dense. 2 quarts per acre in water, very good control. But when you look at it visually compared to 1 quart per acre nitrogen, it's very hard to tell a difference between these two pictures in the middle. And then 2 quarts per acre with nitrogen as well, very hard to tell a difference between these three, versus you might see a little bit of green in these clumps here in the far left picture. Also, I thought I'd show you an aerial view of the study. So this is the entire study here, and we're gonna focus in on what we call the first replication of the study and divide that into the 10 treatments that we had. And I'm going to pull out 3 of those treatments just to give you a better aerial view. So 1 quart of hexazinone in water, you do see some of these smutgrass plants, especially over towards the right end of that picture in the top. Some smutgrass plants are still surviving. You look at 1 quart and 32% UAN, it was nearly complete death of the entire plot. There's a few plants hanging on, but overall, very good control of the smutgrass. And then the bottom is just a picture of smutgrass of 32% UAN. As you expect, nothing happened with that whatsoever. So another thing that we have been looking at, and something that we're still playing with, is using dry fertilizer and impregnating dry fertilizer with hexazinone. And basically what we're doing is taking dry fertilizer and adding liquid herbicide to it and mixing it up really well. And we've done that a couple different ways. So we've used a paint mixer that you put on the end of a drill and just stir it up in a bucket. And then another way that we've done it here is use a commercial bakery mixer, if you will, and mix it up that way. Now, they are doing this different ways in the field, but that's the best way that we can do it here at the center. So we first tried this with ammonium nitrate, and we actually had so much herbicide liquid in there, it was hard to get the ammonium nitrate to spread. It wouldn't dry out very quickly. So, and that was prilled ammonium nitrate. So we had some fertilizer from a different study that was left over. It was 10-5-10. So we impregnated the 10-5-10 with 1, 1.5, and 2 quarts per acre of hexazinone. And we applied the 10-5-10 at 500 pounds per acre. So we're putting out about 50 units of nitrogen, 25 units of phosphorus, and 50 units of potassium. And we spread this with a pendulum fertilizer spreader. So That, I think, is going to be important when you see the pictures from these plots, because with our spreader, we can't get even distribution across the entire width of the swath that we should be getting. In fact, it's probably covering about 3/4 of the normal width that it would cover. So these are pictures from that experiment. So this is broadcast. I'm sorry, I forgot to change this first one over. This should be 2 quarts per acre instead of 1.12 kilograms per hectare. So this is just broadcast hexazinone and water. And this is impregnated fertilizer at 1 quart per acre. And you can see there's pretty much a narrow swath down the center of the plot. It should be as wide as this picture to your left. And you can see living smutgrass on the edge here and dead smutgrass in the middle. So most of that fertilizer was concentrated in the center of that plot, which is why I believe most of the smutgrass is dead in the center of the plot. We can increase the rate up to 2 quarts per acre. We still have living smutgrass towards the edge of those plots. So we're still working on this whole process and trying to figure out the best method. I think we need to switch spreaders. However, sorry, I got to show you the pictures first. This is 1 quart per hectare, 1 quart per acre of hexazinone and water. And 2 quarts, you see pretty good kill. Again, the green mixed in here is Bahia grass that's surviving. And then we go down to the pictures with the impregnated fertilizer. You can see these strips of green smutgrass that survived just because we were not getting that distribution from that spreader. And like I said, we used a pendulum spreader, so this is something that they've done on the commercial level with much bigger equipment than what we have here at the center. But even with this bigger equipment, and this was mowed off, so it's hard to see from this picture, but there's these green strips. I'm trying to highlight one up towards the left corner of this picture, and that is a strip where the smutgrass was not injured. But in this middle area, the smutgrass is pretty much dead from that fertilizer application. I tried to find my picture of this same pasture from earlier this year because I could still see these strips, but I couldn't find it. But anyway, this was still showing up a year later. So we still have quite a bit of work to do with the dry fertilizer impregnation technique. So what are we doing next? We need to look at application timing, 32% UAN. So like I talked about earlier, my friend that did some of this initial, I guess, trial work on his own property did this in early April. That was our intention this year, but with COVID-19, we were really limited in what we could do in the field. So we're going to have to wait on some of that until next year. Also look at other nitrogen sources. So there's other liquid nitrogen sources that we can look at, and then also concentrations of nitrogen sources. So one of my fears is, since we did most of this work in nearly 100% smutgrass, we don't know how the Bahia grass is going to react to this level of fertilizer. So we may need to decrease the level of fertilizer. And if we decrease the level of fertilizer, do we still get the same level of smutgrass control? So if you're thinking about questions, this is probably a good time to be thinking about typing those in because I'm about finished. So what's my take-home message today? Well, really, it's really too early to make a solid recommendation using 32% UAN. I'm becoming more comfortable with it, but we've only had 2 sites in 1 year, and I'd like to get another year under our belt to really make a solid recommendation using ammonium nitrate, urea ammonium nitrate, as a carrier for hexazinone. I think moisture is still going to be a huge component of hexazinone activity. Like my friend in Ona that did this, he saw a lot of injury from the Bahia grass early season, but when he did eventually get rainfall, he did get around, like I said, around 70% control, which is pretty similar to what we've seen in the past. But usually if you don't get that amount of rainfall within 7 days or so, it doesn't work as well. So I'm not sure why, in his case, he was able to wait 2 weeks, get rainfall, and it still worked reasonably well. And I don't know, regardless of whatever tactic we come up with, I think smutgrass control is going to require yearly management. We can't expect to go out with whatever approach, do it one time and expect for it to be gone. So it's going to take annual applications to really get it under control and move forward. So like I said, if you have questions, Andrea tried to highlight this in the beginning, there should be a little orange box with a white arrow at the top right corner of your screen. If you click that arrow, it should expand a box and you should be able to enter questions there. Otherwise, you can email me or call our main office line. Sarah Bostic and I, she is the livestock agent for Sarasota County and also the interim livestock agent for DeSoto County. We've put together a small fact sheet, basically frequently asked questions, and there's 14 questions. And we're going to make sure this fact sheet is up on our website as well. Or you can go to our IFAS site or just Google Smutgrass Control Florida and an IFAS fact sheet should pop up. That one is currently under revision. So I checked this morning and it's still not been updated, but it should be updated shortly. And don't miss next month's ONA webinar or highlight, where our guest speakers are going to be Gene Lawless, the current president of the Florida Cattlemen's Association, and Jim Hanley, executive vice president for the Florida Cattlemen's Association, where they're going to be talking about current issues and initiatives of the Florida Cattlemen's Association. And that will be on August 11th from 11 to 12. And with that, I will begin to answer questions if there are any.
Okay, first question. Does mowing ahead of application have any impact?
Okay, so I get that question a lot. So does mowing before application have any impact? And in the case of hexazinone, the answer is no. We have tried that several times. Dr. Mislively, who was here before me working on smutgrass in the late 70s and 80s, basically found that there was no benefit to mowing with hexazinone. And Jeff Malahy, when he was down in Immokalee, also found that there's no benefit to mowing with hexazinone. In fact, if you go back to previous research by the earliest agronomists here at the center, they found that mowing actually increased the number of smutgrass plants in the pasture. So mowing really isn't that beneficial at all unless you're going to use it as a management method to be able to let your cattle graze it, because once smutgrass is mowed, it will generate pretty good regrowth that cattle will consume for 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay, Elena has a question about cattle eating smutgrass. Do they eat smutgrass? Is the nutritional quality not such that it's desirable?
So generally, every once in a while, a mature smutgrass, you'll see a plant that is grazed down to the ground, and there'll be plants all around it that are untouched. So in general, mature smutgrass is considered unpalatable. So the cattle definitely won't graze it when it's mature. When it is mowed or burned, and it's allowed to regrow for 1 to 2 weeks, the quality of that smutgrass is pretty comparable to Bahia grass. So it's pretty standard for us in Florida It's not great, but it's better than mature smutgrass.
Okay, Jennifer has a question. She says, will you consider testing a product called Wake Up with the nutrient application trials?
Sure, Jennifer, give me a call and we'll discuss it.
Okay. All right, Tony asks, how long after application should we wait to mow the dead plant? And when is it safe to apply Bahia seed after application?
Okay, so those are two good questions. So if smutgrass is going to die from a hexazinone application, it will happen within 30 days. So I would say a month after application, hexazinone has done what it's going to do to the smutgrass. As far as planting or overseeding Bahia grass seed, I think it depends on how much rainfall we have. So if we've had more than 3 inches of rainfall since application, I would say you're probably okay. And it's not going to affect the Bahia grass seed whatsoever.
Okay, the next question's a little bit lengthy. It's from Derek, and it's regarding this particular treatment and limpogress. It says, if you tried spraying 1 quart an acre of hexazinone with UAN in a limpogress pasture, do you estimate that it will increase or decrease injury to limpogress versus just applying the treatment with water?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question. So I generally don't recommend hexazinone on limpogress unless you're at your last resort. So you if you're at the point of no return where you either have to spray it with hexazinone or renovate, then at that point in time, then you have to take the injury you get from the hexazinone. We've observed that when limpogress pastures are fertilized or cut during the year before hexazinone is applied, we tend to see more injury. If it is not fertilized and not cut, it seems to tolerate it better. But as far as your question regarding mixing the UAN with the hexazinone and applying it that way, it's something we haven't looked at yet. So I don't know what's going to happen. My gut tells me that we would see increased injury. And that's what I'd expect with Bahia grass. And that's what my friend did see in Ona with Bahia grass without rainfall. When we did a little different study this year, and I didn't show you the data yet because we haven't recorded any, but just visually looking at the plots, we mixed, and this is Bahia grass, now it's a little bit different. I was expecting more burn with the 32% UAN, but since we had rainfall, it's actually opposite. We're actually seeing less burn on the Bahia grass with the UAN than we did on Bahia grass with just hexazinone alone. So it may depend on whether we're getting rainfall or not. So I don't know yet. Stay tuned.
Okay, another question from Tony. He asks, how damaging is it to oak trees that are in the middle of a treatment area?
Yeah, so another good question. And so that's one thing that I try to point out in all my presentations, and I forgot to today, so thank you for that question, is that hexazinone can be somewhat damaging to oak trees. So if I have tried to kill one, like literally tried to kill one and spray hexazinone up against the fence line with smutgrass underneath it, because I didn't care if that tree died because it was in a fence, it didn't die. But of course, whenever you go try to do that in the pasture where you want to keep that tree, it's going to die, right? So that's just Murphy's Law. When they did the commercial application in Ona, that was early spring, limited rainfall initially, those trees, you can still see some effects on them. I don't know how they sprayed it. I don't know if they sprayed underneath the tree canopy or if they tried to stay away from the trees. I get the impression that they got pretty close to the trees. So in that case, we're still seeing some effect from that application. That's been 14 months, 15 months. In general, I think if you stay outside of the drip line and we get sufficient rainfall, I think you're going to be okay. I don't like to give people a certain number, stay away from it. If you're concerned about an oak tree in your pasture, I suggest you stay a good distance away from it. And if you have smut grass close to that tree, then you need to think about spot treating it with glyphosate.
Okay, that was the last of the questions. So.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, and thanks for the questions. And if you didn't find where to put those questions in, feel free to email me or call the main office, and I will do my best to answer your questions. And again, thank you for attending today.